welcome back for our next video on APUS history. Today we're talking philosophical foundations of the American Revolution. Go ahead and click the link below in the description if you would like some guided notes to follow along while you watch this video. So we're going to stay focused here on the learning objective. Explain how and why colonial attitudes about government and the individual changed in the years leading up to the American Revolution. The College Board gives us their key concepts, and so we want to also stay focused on these. We're really going to be looking at the democratic and republican ideas that influenced the founding fathers and American colonists as they decided to fight for independence. So we're looking at the Enlightenment, we're going to look at the role of religion, and we're going to focus in on two particular founding documents, Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. So as we go through this outline, you're going to come across a lot of primary sources, a little more than usual in these videos, but it's really important since we're looking at the foundations of the revolution to look at the actual text that inspired the people that were writing these documents. So here's a quote by a historian, Pauline Maier. The colonists' attitude towards civil uprising were part of a broader Anglo-American political tradition. In the course of the 18th century, colonists became increasingly interested in the ideas of 17th century English revolutionaries and the later writers who carried on this and developed this tradition. By the 1760s, this tradition provided a strong unifying element between colonists North and South. It offered to a corpus of ideas about public authority and popular political responsibilities that shaped the American Revolutionary moment. Spokesmen for this English revolutionary tradition were distinguished in the 18th century above all by their outspoken defense of the people's right to rise up against their rulers. So really what Maier is arguing here is that the American colonists didn't just one day wake up and say, I think we'll go for a revolution. Rather, they were inspired by writers in the 17th century and those that continued into the 18th century. So that's what we're looking at here in this lesson is what was that inspiration? So what we want to look back on are some of the important English documents. In 1215, the Magna Carta was signed, and one of the examples or one of the rights that were illustrated in the Magna Carta was that English citizens had a right to be protected from excessive taxes. That continues on in the Petition of Right in 1628, where they said no taxes can be levied without the consent of Parliament, and also no soldiers may be quartered upon the citizenry. And so these rights of Englishmen are some of the things that the American colonists are referencing when they are discussing what their rights are as British citizens as well. However, it's important to note that still at the start of this time period, the 1760s, most people are very loyal to the King and Great Britain. And it's not until significantly closer to the Declaration of Independence in 1776 that we even have, around 50% of people desiring independence. A lot of these revolutionary ideas are going to come around from the English Civil War. And what helps them come to America is print culture and transatlantic exchanges. And so what we see is that there are numerous newspapers and pamphlets that are going across the Atlantic Ocean and that are spreading the ideas of Europeans to the Americas and also of Americans to Europeans. Also, what's very interesting at this time is that this was an era of collective reading. And so pamphlets that were short would often be found in taverns and restaurants where someone would read it aloud for the whole public to hear. All of these things strengthened intercolonial connections that would be necessary for waging a war against Britain. Here's another quotation. Looking back on the Revolution, John Adams is writing a letter to Thomas Jefferson. As to the history of the Revolution, my ideas may be peculiar, perhaps singular. What do we mean by the Revolution? The war? That was no part of the Revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The Revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775, in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington. So Adams is arguing here that when we talk about the American Revolution, it actually should mean the time period before the war, the time when people's minds were changed. And so that's now what we're going to dig into. Let's talk the political philosophy of the Enlightenment. There are many Enlightenment philosophers. The one that is most commonly addressed in an APUS history classroom is going to be John Locke. However, other philosophers like Hobbes, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu also could be mentioned. And so we're really looking at the culmination of their ideas and how those ideas became part of American ideas of politics. So one of the most common ones that you'll want to be familiar with is the idea of natural rights, that every person has a guarantee to life, liberty, and property. Another really essential one is the idea of the social contract, that when a citizen wants to have a government, they're going to give up some of their rights for the benefits of being part of that country or part of that government. Also essential is this idea of needing to or having the right to overthrow the government when it is no longer expressing the will of the people. So ideas of republican forms of government, that the government would be elected by the people, all of these things are essential. And as we talked about with the pamphlets and newspapers, they come from Europe and they inform the American people about new ideas about government. So let's look at one excerpt from one of John Locke's writings called The Two Treatises of Government. Since men hope to preserve their property by establishing a government, they will not want that government to destroy this objective. When legislators try to destroy or take away the property of the people or try to reduce them to slavery, they put themselves in a state of war with the people who can then refuse to obey the laws. When legislators try to gain or give someone else absolute power over lives, liberty, or property of the people, they abuse the power which the people had put into their hands. It is then the privilege of the people to establish a new legislature to provide for their safety and security. So a couple ideas here. You see kind of the ideas of natural rights, consent of the government, and the right to overthrow the government when it is no longer providing for their safety and security. Okay, let's shift gears now into the role of religion. If you remember from period 2, we discussed the Great Awakening. So the Great Awakening is this religious revival that is taking place. It's starting in New England. It spreads across the colonies. But how does this influence the revolution? Well, it begins to develop some attitudes about liberty, freedom, anti-authoritarianism that begin to be commonplace. For example, as a result of the Great Awakening, church members believed it was their responsibility to judge their ministers. Now, for many of these New England Puritan towns, the church leader may also have been part of the government, and to question their leader was a question their preacher, their minister, all of that was not allowed early on. The Great Awakening makes that more commonplace. So it's not that big of a stretch that if they're willing to question the church leader, that they would be willing to question other forms of government. Here's an excerpt from Phyllis Wheatley where we can really see the ideas of liberty and religion coming together. But how presumptuous shall we hope to find divine acceptance with the Almighty mind? While yet, O deed ungenerous, they disgrace and hold in bondage Afric's blameless race. Let virtue reign, and thou accord our prayers. Be victory ours, and generous freedom theirs. So Phyllis Wheatley is a African-American person who was enslaved and got her freedom. She's writing during the Revolutionary War here, and she's using biblical language and imagery to discuss the goal of freedom for the entire country, but also for enslaved persons. So we can see the connection between religion, politics, and the war here. So let's dive into this idea of protest literature. Now, this is an idea that Harvard professor John Stauffer discusses in his course, History of American Protest. And what he believes is that literature can be any primary source, and protest literature is primary sources that transform the self and are a catalyst for change. They influence individuals to engage in formal protest. And most protest literature doesn't just influence the people of that era, but also influences other eras as well. He says, protest literature serves as a catalyst for individual as well as social change. It gives voice to the masses, uniting isolated and incoherent grumblings. It helps unify a vision, an idea, disenchantment, or frustration that leads to this vision of a better society. Protest literature taps a vein of dissent and announces to people that they're not alone in their frustrations. So we're going to dig into two examples of protest literature next. The first is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So his pamphlet, Common Sense, is going to be published in January 1776. And at the time of publishing, there was not a cohesive attitude towards independence. It was significantly divided. Thomas Paine was born in England. He was a Quaker. He's a radical opponent of slavery. And he ends up being recruited by Ben Franklin to come to America to advocate for the Patriot movement. Now, Common Sense is the most popular pamphlet of this time. There were more than 2,000 pamphlets published during this time, but none come even close to the success of Common Sense. So as you can see, 500,000 copies were sold in a year, but because of the nature of collective reading, most scholars would argue that 2 to 5 people would have come in contact with each copy that was sold. So this pamphlet not only unites a hugely diverse group of people and helps Americans to define themselves as Americans, but it also convinces people that the idea of independence is common sense. So how does he do this? He argues forcefully by declaring that it is contrary to common sense that a large continent like America would be ruled by a small island far away. It is contrary to common sense that people would pledge allegiance to a king and government that were corrupt and whose laws were unreasonable. And he uses the language of the Enlightenment philosophers, specifically natural rights. He uses the term republic positively, and he uses language that is accessible to the people. Another interesting strategy that he used was that he would not use the word king or British fully spelled out. Instead, he would use dashes, almost as if it were like a swear word in a formal document. He also declares that monarchy is sacrilegious, that it goes against God, and the Bible disapproves of kings, thus linking that impact of religion and the Great Awakening, the idea of God's will and the American people fighting for independence being the ultimate goal of God. All of those ideas are incorporated into this pamphlet called Common Sense. So here's an excerpt from it here. I have heard it asserted by some that as America hath flourished under her former connection with Great Britain, that the same connection is necessary towards her future happiness, and will always have the same effect. Nothing can be more fallacious than this kind of argument. We may well assert that because a child has thrived upon milk, that it is never to have meat, or that the first 20 years of our lives is to become a precedent for the next 20. But even this is admitting more than is true. For as I answer roundly, that America would have flourished as much, and probably much more, had no European power had anything to do with her. The commerce by which she hath enriched herself are the necessaries of life, and will always have a market, while eating is the custom of Europe. In America, the law is king, for as in absolute governments, the king is law. So in free countries, the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. So here you can see common language that is accessible to the regular person, using ideas of common sense, like, hey, let's really think about what we're saying here and flesh out whether this is true. And so this was a pamphlet that many people found to be really convincing and persuasive towards the movement for independence. Thus, 6 months later, we see the Declaration of Independence. So this goes back to the Second Continental Congress, where in June, Richard Henry Lee introduces a resolution declaring colonial independence, and 5 delegates, including Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, are chosen to draft this list of grievances and basic principles justifying the revolution. July 2nd, Congress officially adopts the resolution, and on July 4th, they adopt the Declaration of Independence. So here is an excerpt from the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So again, you can see a lot of the ideas, the political philosophies that were part of the Enlightenment. Also, what's interesting is that there was so much language in the Declaration similar to Common Sense that many people thought Thomas Paine to be the author of the Declaration. So going back to your objective, explain how and why colonial attitudes about government and the individual changed in the years leading up to the revolution. I really hope that this lesson was helpful for you in understanding that objective, and if so, please like and subscribe.